I was born in the winter of 1949 in a small wooden house at the edge of a sleepy American town. The war had ended just a few years earlier, but its shadow still lingered in every home, including ours. My father, like so many other men, had returned from Europe with scars. Some you could see on his skin, others you could only feel in the silence that often filled our dinner table. My mother was strong, though. Stronger than any woman I've known since. She carried the weight of the family on her back, often working from sunrise to sunset, keeping the household together when money was scarce and food was simpler than what you see on plates today. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. Childhood back then didn't come wrapped in shiny plastic or glowing screens. Our toys were carved out of wood, our clothes often handed down from cousins or neighbors, and our entertainment was the sound of the radio crackling in the kitchen while my mother cooked beans, cornbread, or a stew that could stretch for days. I grew up with 2 brothers and 1 sister, and though we fought often, we shared everything: beds, secrets, and sometimes even the same shoes. I was the youngest, and because of that, everyone thought I was fragile. But in truth, I think I learned to be tougher than most. You had to be. Life didn't leave much room for softness in those days. Looking back, I realized that childhood in the late 40s and early 50s was painted in shades of both joy and hardship. There were days when the sky seemed brighter than it ever does now, and nights when the silence in our little house was heavy enough to make a child hold her breath. My father rarely spoke of the war, but sometimes, late at night when I was supposed to be asleep, I would hear him mutter in his dreams. He would wake up with a sudden gasp, sweating even in the winter cold, and my mother would rush to calm him. As a little girl, I never understood why a man so strong could be shaken by something I couldn't see. But as I grew, I realized the war had never really left him. It lived inside him like a shadow. Our town was small, the kind where everyone knew each other's names and secrets. Summer smelled like fresh-cut hay, and winters carried the smoke of coal fires that seemed to linger on your clothes for days. We didn't have much, but we had each other. I remember one winter, 1953, I must have been only 4 years old. Our heater broke down. My father didn't have the money to fix it, so he brought home extra firewood, chopped by his own hands even though they were calloused and blistered from working at the factory. We all slept in the same room that winter, huddled together under thick quilts my mother had stitched by hand. I thought it was fun then, like camping. Only years later did I understand the desperation that lived in those nights. But not all memories are heavy. Childhood has a way of shining through the cracks of hardship. I can still see the little creek near our house where we caught tadpoles and skipped stones. I can still hear the sound of my mother humming hymns while she washed clothes by hand. Her voice soft but steady, carrying a strength that became the backbone of our family. She often told me, "Life is not about what you have in your hands, but what you hold in your heart." At the time, I didn't really know what she meant. But as the years passed, those words would come back to me. Sometimes as a comfort, sometimes as a haunting reminder. Hardship had a way of arriving at our doorstep without knocking. My parents did their best to shield us, but children notice more than adults like to admit. By the time I was 6, I had already learned to read the worry in my mother's eyes whenever the bills arrived, or the silence in my father's face when he came home with grease on his hands and exhaustion in his bones. In those days, money was a stranger who never stayed long. My father's factory job paid just enough to keep food on the table, but never enough to feel secure. I can still see my mother counting coins at the kitchen table, lips moving silently as though she was praying. Maybe she was. She stretched every dollar like it was dough, but sometimes even her magic couldn't make it rise. There were nights when dinner was bread soaked in milk, and mornings when I carried a lunch pail with nothing but a biscuit wrapped in paper. Yet strangely, we never thought of ourselves as poor. Everyone in town lived some version of the same struggle, and in a way, that made it easier to bear. One memory, though, still cuts through me like a knife. I was about 7 when my sister Ruth fell terribly ill. There wasn't money for a proper doctor, so my mother nursed her at home with remedies passed down from her own mother. Herbal teas, warm cloths, whispered prayers. I remember lying awake that night, listening to Ruth's labored breathing. And for the first time in my young life, I felt the cold hand of fear close around my heart. I prayed, though I didn't know if God was listening. My father sat by Ruth's bed, silent, his rough hand gently resting on her tiny one. It was the only time I ever saw him cry, though he thought no one noticed. I noticed. Children always notice. Ruth pulled through, but the shadow of that night never left me. It was my first lesson that life was fragile, and that love sometimes came wrapped in worry. But just as hardship carved itself into my memory, so did moments of innocence. I still recall the sound of summer cicadas, the laughter of my brothers chasing each other through fields, the sweet taste of lemonade my mother made on Sundays. Life had a way of giving us crumbs of joy even as it took away loaves of comfort. It was around this time, though, that something happened. Something that changed the way I looked at my family forever. I was still too young to fully understand it, but old enough to feel its weight. One evening, when the sun had dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the kitchen floor, I overheard a conversation between my parents. They thought I was asleep, but curiosity had its claws in me. I pressed my ear against the wooden door frame and listened. My father's voice was low, almost trembling. My mother's sharper, urgent. Words like truth, secret, and they can't know floated through the air like ghosts. I didn't understand them then, but I understood the fear in their tone. It was the first time I realized my parents carried a story they weren't ready to share. And that secret, though buried, would eventually reach me like a wave reaching the shore. I didn't sleep much that night. The whispers of my parents' conversation clung to me like the chill of winter air. At 7 years old, I couldn't piece together the meaning, but I felt its weight in my chest. It was like a storm cloud hanging low over our home. The next morning, life went on as if nothing had happened. My mother set the table with biscuits and jam, humming softly. My father left for the factory with his lunch pail swinging at his side. My brothers bickered, my sister smiled faintly, and yet I couldn't shake the memory of the words I had overheard. Truth, secret, they can't know. Days passed, but the seed of suspicion had already taken root in me. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way my mother's eyes lingered on me when she thought I wasn't looking. The way my father sometimes seemed distant, as though his thoughts were miles away from our little home. One Sunday afternoon, as we sat on the porch, my curiosity got the better of me. I turned to my mother and asked as innocently as a child could, "Mama, what don't we know?" Her face went pale, as if the blood drained from it in an instant. She scolded me, telling me not to ask foolish questions, but her trembling hands gave her away. For weeks, the air in the house carried a tension I couldn't explain. Even Ruth, who was older and wiser than me, noticed. She pulled me aside one evening and whispered, "Something's not right. I hear them at night, too. Children shouldn't have to carry secrets, but sometimes life doesn't give you a choice." It was in the autumn of 1956 when the truth finally spilled. I remember the air was crisp, the leaves painting the ground in fiery shades of red and gold. My father had come home later than usual, his face heavy with something more than factory dust. My mother tried to keep us busy in the kitchen, but the strain was too thick to hide. That night, after we had gone to bed, I crept out again, this time braver, more determined. I crouched behind the doorframe as my parents argued in the dim glow of a single lamp, and then, in a voice that cracked under the weight of years, my father said the words that would carve themselves into my memory forever. "She deserves to know the truth. One day she'll find out that she's not ours." The room spun around me. My little body froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Not ours?" The words echoed in my mind, louder than any church bell, sharper than any blade. I stumbled back into my room, my heart pounding. I didn't understand all of it, not yet, but I knew enough to feel the earth shifting beneath me. The life I thought I had, the family I thought I belonged to, suddenly felt like a fragile story written on paper that could burn in a single spark. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of my sister's soft breathing beside me. For the first time in my young life, I felt utterly alone. And though I didn't know it then, that secret, those words, would shape everything that came after. The morning after those words shattered my world, I moved through the house like a ghost. My mother's smile felt forced, my father's silence heavier than ever. I wanted to scream, to ask them what he meant, but fear sealed my lips. Children often think they are powerless, but silence is its own kind of power. In my silence, I watched more carefully than ever. I noticed how my mother sometimes avoided my gaze, how my father's hand lingered on my shoulder with a tenderness that felt like apology. My siblings carried on as if nothing was wrong, but I couldn't. Every laugh felt hollow. Every meal tasted of lies. I began to wonder about things I'd never questioned before. Why my hair was darker than Ruth's golden locks. Why my eyes didn't mirror my brother's. Why neighbors sometimes gave me curious looks that I had always brushed off as imagination. One afternoon, I gathered the courage to ask Ruth if she ever noticed anything different about me. She hesitated, too long for comfort, then shook her head and said, "You think too much." But her voice cracked in the middle, and I knew she was lying. The seed of doubt grew into a forest of questions. Who was I, really? Where did I come from? And why had my parents hidden the truth from me? That winter was the coldest I could remember. Not because of the snow or the biting winds, but because of the chill that settled inside me. I carried the weight of that secret alone, a burden too heavy for a child, and yet I couldn't put it down. And then one night, as the wind howled outside and the house creaked under the weight of the storm, my mother came to my bedside. She thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. She leaned close, brushed a strand of hair from my face, and whispered words I'll never forget. "Forgive us, child. One day you'll know everything, but when you do, it may break you." Her tears fell onto my cheek before she slipped away, leaving me trembling in the dark. That was the night I realized my life was not the story I thought it was. It was something else, something deeper, hidden, waiting to be uncovered. And so began my journey, not just through the years of America's changes, but through the unraveling of my own identity. I didn't know then what truths lay buried, or how much pain and resilience it would take to face them. But I knew this: nothing in my world would ever feel the same again.